All right, so this week we are in, this is kind of a weird one, but the Law 7, the Law of Proactivity. And the writer of this gives us several different verses as he comes towards the end of his particular talk about being proactive. And I just wanted to read a couple of things out of this because it's a little bit different the way he looks at it. If you think about proactive, what do you think about? If you are proactive,
fix it before it breaks because you know it's just going to break. Right. Preventative maintenance on your car.
Preventative maintenance on a car. You're being proactive, right? I'm going to change the tires before one blows out on the road and I get stuck there for 3.5 hours, right? Or brakes or oil or anything, right? What else?
You're going to clean your house before your wife comes home.
I'm being proactive. I'm going to head off that angry female before she gets home, right? How often does that work?
I don't know.
All right, so what else? How else can you be proactive? How many of you in the business world have heard the term be proactive? It was very, very popular about 10 years ago or so. You're going to be proactive. That means you get ahead of something before what? Crisis, right? Avert it. We're going to avert the crisis. We're going to get ahead of this before it gets out of hand, right? There are a couple of major corporations as of recent who did not learn to be proactive, right? And it's cost them billions of dollars for failure to be proactive in a context. How can we individually be proactive, right? With cars, cleaning the house. How about yourself?
In what regard?
Well, just in really any regard, right? Are we ever proactive? Do we try to head off problems with family? Do we ever head off problems with ourselves? I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to get a handle on this. What about illnesses? Right? Got a weird tingling or a twinge and you're like, yeah, this could be bad. Or, right, I can see a health problem coming, so I'm going to do particular things to change that. Right? Some people might change eating habits. They might try to lose weight. They try to work out more. They start vitamins. They do all kinds of different things because they're trying to head off oncoming things. Is that reasonable? Right? So being proactive. His is just a little bit different because he goes through kind of a conversation as it comes to this law number 7 where he talks about the reaction to things, right? Because he says the reaction is expected. So here's how he said, and I just want to read what he has to say. All right, he says, many of us have known people who, after years of being passive and compliant, suddenly go ballistic, and we wonder what happened. Anybody ever know anybody like that? They're just calm, and then just all of us said, I just don't know why they're acting like that. Anybody know anybody like that? Anybody ever been that person? All right. You're just calm, and then I don't know why they just blew up out of the clear blue sky. They just freaked out, right? We all wonder what happened. And he goes on to say here, he says, we blame it on the counselor they are seeing or the company they have been keeping. Anybody ever know anybody, maybe a kid or a family member or something like that, started hanging out with new people? And what happens to them? Their behaviors change. You will definitely see behaviors change. And that's why one of the things we talk about is be careful of the company that you keep, right? That's somewhat of a scriptural context, is you got to be aware of who you're hanging around because more than likely, you are going to have more difficulty raising somebody up than they are to do what? Tearing somebody down, right? They can bring you down a lot faster because for some reason it's easier to do wrong than it is to do right. And so this person who is calm, relaxed, easygoing, and then all of a sudden, pow, right? And so he's talking about, that's the reaction part, right? So in reality, they have been complying for years and their pent-up rage explodes. This reactive phase of boundary creation is helpful, especially for victims. So he says, when somebody, you ever had enough? I have had enough. Anybody ever said you're done? I am so done. Right? I'm done with your behavior. I'm done with your actions. I'm done with the job's behaviors or actions. Anybody ever quit a job just because you are done with their foolishness? Right? Any ever walked away from Sam, I had 2 of them so far, right? Because he was done, right? Isn't that what you said to me? I'm done. And he moved on to the next, right? Because we get done with it. We get tired of dealing with things. We get tired of putting up with the junk that whatever it is putting forth to us. right? And the writer of this, the Cloud Townsend people, they say that reaction is expected, that we're going to have a reaction moment, that we're going to have an opportunity where we are going to explode, where we're going to get angry, where we're going to create these boundaries, right? That we're going to have to say, we've got to change something about our life. We've got to change something that's going on. And it's perfectly fine to do that. Sometimes one of the things that I've mentioned before is we have to be careful going from one extreme to the other. Where we have no boundaries, then all of a sudden we have what? Too many. Or overarching or overreaching boundaries. Because we want to fix it, and so we just kind of go from nothing to clamping down 100%. Anybody ever experienced that? Right? Right, rhetorical question. Anybody ever done that? I just go so far the other way that guess what? Are you right or wrong over here?
Well, don't you find out that maybe at times you let things go and it build up to a point where the overreaction of boundaries is, if I should have done this all along, now I'm bounding everything because I'm just aggravated.
Well, that would be
so much for so long. I never said anything, never did anything. Now I'm done.
Well, that's right here. After being passive and compliant, they suddenly go ballistic. I've had enough. I'm done with it, right? So he goes on to say, while this is expected, the reaction is expected, he also says that it is good for us to have that reaction moment. Because in order to set boundaries, sometimes we have to be very, very extreme in our behavior. And you're like thinking, Andy, how's it ever good to be extreme? Huh? Sometimes we have to stand up and yell it. I will not continue to put up with this. I will not continue to experience this. You will no longer get to treat me thusly. Anybody ever said that? Don't raise your hand, right? Anybody ever said that to somebody? You ever felt the need to say, I can no longer accept how you're treating me? Be it a person, be it a job, be it a community, whatever it happens to be. Sometimes a church. I'll no longer allow you to treat me like that. And it becomes this real upset. And so he goes on to say, but when is enough enough? When do you, I don't know if back off is the right phrase for it. He says, but when is enough enough? Reaction phases are necessary, but not sufficient for the establishment of boundaries. What he's saying is the boundaries are not built during your reactive period. That's when you're just shutting everything off. He said this is where proactivity begins. Once you have your reaction, once you have your upset moment, and what you hope is that reaction is something quick. Right? I talk with clients and especially young children a lot about reaction versus response. Do you know the difference? There is a difference between a reaction and a response. Right? What part of the brain does fight or flight come from?
Amygdala.
That's back here at the base of your brain. It's a little video thing, right? That is where your reactive response comes from. When somebody says something to you and you... That comes out of where? Right? That's quick reactive ability. If somebody hits you and you hit them back, that's a reaction. That comes out of that part. It has not, that feeling, thought, emotion has not moved from this part of your head up into where? What are these called? These halves of the brain. The cortex. Right? The cortex is the reasoning part of your brain. So the reaction that you have to needing to set boundaries, which is fine, should be quick, should be fast, should be something that just happens. And then you move that need, feeling, emotion, or thought from the reactionary part of the brain to the responsive part of the brain, which means we think about it. We start to get proactive. Now we're going to start setting realistic boundaries. I think that may be the difference between the reactive. Sorry, that's somewhat disturbing. I think that can be the difference between reaction and responsive in our boundaries is we have a reactionary boundary, which is stop it. Especially if it's physical, verbal, abuse of any type. We're not doing that, right? And then what do? We start to think about it. How will I set this boundary differently? How will I begin to process that boundary? Does that make sense?
Well, you plan how you're going to respond to certain situations, especially if they're being repeated
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over. And so if you talk with yourself and practice a little bit
Mhm.
about how you're going to respond, then when you get that reaction, you already have a plan in place of how you're going to respond. And so when you do think through those situations, it is being proactive, but I would almost say like kind of pre-planning.
No, pre-planning, proactive could
You know
be
what I mean?
arguably the same concept.
Just sort of get it into people's minds to where you're actually thinking about how you're going to respond if this continues to happen, so that you're not explosive.
Mm-hmm. So it becomes a response instead of a reaction. What would be an example of a reaction in, let's say, a marriage? If somebody who goes through this explosive moment, right, where they all of a sudden go ballistic, what could be a reactionary response that a spouse might do?
Well, if you've made an assumption about a behavior, do I need to be specific?
Can you expand on that just a little bit?
Like if, I guess, if an interaction that you had maybe was taken wrong or out of context because maybe it was seen at a distance, and then there was an explosion later about how you seem to react with someone or something like that, and then, you know, if that continually happens to you constantly, then you can put a plan in place, I guess, to have a better response when you know that type of interaction or that type of reaction is coming for you, and you're going to have that interaction with that person.
Very deep. How about this? How about a simple one? You having a spouse that might be verbally abusive. And the abuse occurs, whatever that abuse is, and you leave. I'm out. I'm out the door. That's a reaction, is it not? It's a quick response to, I'm not doing it anymore. And you're out. What would be a response after that? What would be the thought up process?
I'm not going to tolerate you speaking to me in that tone or with those words.
Would that not be coming back to that in some form or fashion and having a conversation with them? Talking about it. I'm no longer going to do this. I'm no longer going to allow this. I'm no longer going to accept this. This is how I will do. This will be my boundary, right? I'm going to set up this. This is what's going to happen if this continues.
Well, that's the problem, that people don't circle back.
Mm-hmm.
You can walk off, right? Or leave the conversation and remove yourself from the situation. But then if you don't circle back, you're not teaching that individual what it is or how you want to be treated. And negotiating that.
Remember in the auditorium 4 years ago when we started this class, we talked about anger. And one of the ways that we deal with anger is sometimes we have to be willing to withdraw from the moment and step away, right? What does that give us? If you're angry and you pull away and you step away for a minute, what does that give us?
You can decompress and not be so angry.
Right. Opportunity to calm down. Why was that a problem? Because once we calm down, once we have time to think about it, once we have time to process it, what do we end up doing?
Letting it go and not talking about it.
All right, anybody ever heard the term, we swept it under the rug? We just never dealt with it, right? We never processed it again. We just kind of let everything settle out and we like the peace, and so we do what? Nothing. We do absolutely nothing, right? What you need to do in the response concept is you've got to come back and you've got to address the issue. Again, this is a theme in a lot of this stuff, is making sure we come back and do what? Talk about it, engage about it, process it. Emotionally, the reactive stance brings diminishing returns. You must react to find your own boundaries, but having found them, you must not use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. But if you are always biting and devouring one another, watch out, beware of destroying another. Galatians 5:13 and 15. Eventually, you must rejoin the human race. How many of you just want to walk away and never come back? Right? Well, a cousin on my dad's side posted a thing on his Facebook, said, he was in the wood, I'm lost, please send help. And I posted to him, I said, I'm not sure that being lost in the woods is a bad thing. Build yourself a shelter and kick back, right? How many of you would like to do that? Right? I'm going to withdraw from the world and I'm going to hang out, right? He says you can't do that. You must eventually rejoin the human race you have reacted to. You've got to rejoin these situations and establish connections as equals, loving your neighbor as yourself. This is the beginning of the establishment of proactive instead of reactive boundaries. And so what you start to do is you start to reconnect with people and start to set up appropriate boundaries. Your initial reactive boundary was pretty harsh, wasn't it? Y'all ever felt bad after an initial reaction? Man, I really feel bad about that. I probably shouldn't have said that. But you know what? Maybe I shouldn't have said it, but you know what? It probably, what?
Needed to be said.
How many of you said something horrible and it needed to be said? You know what I do for a living? I tell people that on the intakes. I said, listen, you pay me to tell you the hard things. You pay me to say the hard things. You pay me to not pat you on the back and tell you everything will be fine. That is not my job. My job is to help you see reality, truth, and a direction forward. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy, but we have to be willing to say that. Sometimes you have to be willing to say what needs to be said. Sometimes you have to tell people, you got to move forward. You got to move on. Sometimes you got to say, you have to change the way you do things. We have to be willing to do that. So he says proactive people are able to love others as themselves. They have mutual respect. They're able to die to self and not return evil for evil. They have gotten past the reactive stance of law and are able to love and react. And so he says, listen to Jesus, compare the reactive person who is still controlled by the law and others with the free person. He says, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, do what? Turn to them the other cheek. Matthew 5:38 and 39. Right? So which is reactive out of these two? Eye for an eye. Somebody gouges out your eye, what do you do to them? You know, that's the example in the law. If you lose your arm because of the failure of another person, what happens to the person who caused the arm loss? They lose their arm. That's how the eye for an eye worked. If you did something to somebody else, they did an equal thing back to you. That was the eye. Jesus says, right, responsive or proactivity says that, you know what? I'm going to take a breath for a minute and I'm going to turn the other cheek. I'm going to think about it. I don't think that means you allow somebody to keep smacking you around, but it's what's our purpose, right? We're going to think through it before we just react to it. It says, do not try to get to freedom without owning your reactive period and feelings. You do not need to act this out, but you do need to express the feelings. You need to practice and gain assertiveness. You need to get far enough away from the abusive people to be able to fence your properties against further invasion. And he says, but do not stay there. Spiritual adulthood has higher goals than finding yourself. A reactive stage is a stage, not the identity. And in this chapter, he talks about people who stay in the reactionary. Have you ever met anybody that maybe went ballistic and then stayed there? And life becomes, he uses an example here. Let me flip back to it because I thought it was, I just didn't highlight it. He says, in reality, they have been complying for years and their pent-up rage explodes. Their reactive phase of boundary creation is helpful, especially for victims. They need to get out of the powerless, victimized place into which they may be forced by physical or sexual abuse, right? So it's important that they do that. They said, however, it is crucial for the 2-year-old to throw the peas at mommy, but to continue that at 43 is too much. It is crucial for victims of abuse to feel the rage and hatred of being powerless, but to be screaming victim rights for the rest of their lives is being stuck in a victim mentality. Anybody know anybody? And please don't raise your hand. Anybody know anybody in the victim mentality? Don't look at your spouse either. Right? Anybody know anybody like that? Stuck in the victim mentality. Something bad happened to them. They reacted to it and now they live. What is their identity? Oh, this happened to me. Right? You ever met the person who that is all they ever talk about?
What happened to me?
This is what happened to me.
I have family members like that. Ex-family members.
Well, but they get attention, and I think that's why people stay there.
Was that the reactionary? Is that the goal of the reactionary? We want people to see me. Yeah. Is it always the goal of the reactionary? I don't think so. You can be reactionary and then shut it down, right? I had my moment, I moved on from it, and I built on it, and I did better, and I learned how to respond to it instead of react to it. It is the person who becomes a victim, stays the victim. Right? Spousal abuse is horrible. You escape spousal abuse. And for the next 30 years, what do you talk about? Oh, my ex-husband used to beat me. Oh, it was horrible when he beat. It's 30 years later.
Yeah, but you got to move past.
That's what he's saying, right? We move to setting the boundaries. We can't live in what he calls here the victim mentality. All right, so those of us who are reasonably emotionally balanced and emotionally not you.
I know.
Emotionally intelligent. What do we say about people? What's our problem with some of today's younger people? They live in a what?
A reactive state.
Well, what is this? Y'all ever said they just have a victim mentality? When you have a victim mentality, how do you live your life?
You don't take responsibility. So part of the problem is you don't take charge of your life.
No ownership, yeah. Personal accountability.
That would be proactive.
Yeah.
The proactivity means we take charge of what's going on in our life and we make the changes that we need to make. It's no longer, it's just, all right, here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to handle it. Here's what I'm going to process forward. This is what I'm going to change. This is how I'm no longer going to allow people to treat me. This is how I am no longer going to treat another person, because yet it goes back to personal responsibility. I think Jason is exactly right on that. We also have to make sure that we are not allowing these things to continue to occur. Sometimes that means changing a job. Sometimes that means setting appropriate boundaries with family and keeping them at a distance. Family, friends, neighbors, whatever you want to call them. Right? Sometimes we have to set up the appropriate boundary with people. We got to, as it says, set up our property lines. Yes?
You know, you just said something that made me think, I think part of that too is accepting the cost and the fallout.
Mm-hmm.
Because with some of those situations, you can almost forecast that there's going to be second, third order effects, some of which would potentially be that person or persons or those individuals will never want to speak to you again by addressing what is essentially reality.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be at peace with that. Like if you are willing to speak on facts, reality, and accountability, you have to accept it by inserting that into the conversation with those individuals, knowing that the fallout may be, we're done, I'm never going to speak to you again. You have to be at peace with that potential.
One of the things we talked about last week, Ray, was the law of evaluation. That means being willing to accept the result of setting boundaries. We have to take a look at one of the things that keeps us from being willing to do that is we're unwilling to accept somebody not wanting to be our friend anymore. We're willing to accept somebody cutting us off. Well, they're going to talk to me. I'm never talking to them again. And then we end up in this cycle. And I'm like, I like that cycle. Yeah.
But I think those are the consequences why the boundaries work, because in the moment the relationship is kind of shaken, it forces both parties to analyze. If they want to continue the relationship, they have to find out what was causing the friction between them and what it caused it to become where one of them had to put a boundary. So I think it might seem like, a broken relationship. I think what it forces is to the relationship to clean, and if there is an intention for the relationship to continue, both parties will put their, whatever the party that wasn't, following the boundaries, change their behavior if they want to continue a relationship. But if they don't, they will still just like that end it. But I think the consequences is to force the other party to, see what is wrong and what they're doing wrong, and then say, hey, I need to change this. Maybe they don't change it, that means it just wasn't meant to be.
All right, Sherry, can I have 2 more minutes? All right. So, she gave me a hard time. It's time to go, Andy. We're 5 minutes. So, all right. So, in relationships, and I'm just going to use marriages as an example, one of the things I talk to people about is discourse in a marriage. Difficulty, hard times, struggle in a relationship is not typically the beginning of a problem. Right? So affairs or abuse or lying or whatever it is not typically the cause of where you are. What causes it? Right? What leads us there? Right? A marriage that ends up in separation or divorce, a friendship that ends up in breaking up, it did not start with that one instance of what happened.
It's circling back.
What?
And having those conversations. All those little conversations.
Right? We'll never get here if we do what?
ignore the cause, right?
Well, no, we won't get here. If we ignore the cause, then that's exactly where we're going to end up, right? But if we know, look, the cause could be lack of patience, lack of understanding, lack of listening, lack of time spent, lack of intimacy, lack of whatever you want to call it in any type of relationship. Somewhere back here is the cause. We got to figure out what the cause is. If we can come back and circle back to what is causing us to have the discord that we are having in the up here. Discourse is not the right word. Sorry, discord. The discord, shut up. The discord here is created by something back here. We have to be able to come back and address this. That could be years in the past. Years. If you've been married for 40 years and all of a sudden you're looking at divorce or separation, it did not start right here. Where did it start? 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it happens to be.
You keep talking about talk.
Say again, who?
Talk.
Talk.
Talk is okay, but talk is cheap if there's no action.
Okay. So how do you get to action?
I mean, you go to counseling for years and you talk and talk and talk, but you don't have any action on either part.
All right. So what is the most important part of the interaction to adjust the root cause? So if you don't like the way your spouse talks to you, and you say, I don't like the way you talk to me, you're disrespectful, you're rude, you're ugly, whatever it is, the action would be, I will no longer stay in your presence when you what?
Are speaking?
In general, right? Or
Well, I mean-
I will no longer stay in the moment as long as you're treating me like that. I will not accept you talking to me like that, referring to me like that, engaging with me like that. The action is I withdraw myself from them. We talked about, was it last week or the week before, we talked about disfellowshipment. The idea of disfellowshipment is that we want to hurt that person to get them to miss the fellowship. That would be the same here. I'm going to withdraw as your spouse or your friend until you change your behavior because I will no longer allow you to interact with me. See, that's a proactive boundary. You're not screaming at them, I can't believe you talk to me like that. How dare you talk to me like that? Right? That's your reaction. The response is, I can no longer accept that.
Is it okay if you scream? I can no longer accept that.
I think that might be beyond the reaction.
Are you willing to accept when your spouse tells you that's fine, bye, see you later?
Okay, so what does that come to?
Accept the cause.
Did somebody say a party?
What?
I did not. He did.
What?
Oh.
Tammy!
I thought it was
Ray.
What?
Thank you.
It sounded like something came. I heard it.
Listen, just a second. I've said it 100 times. Boundaries are a waste of time if you're not willing to accept the cost of that boundary. It does not matter what the cost is. If you want it to stop, or you're going to go crazy, or you're going to take your own life because of it, you have to set the boundary, regardless of what it costs you. That is a very, very, very difficult statement to put into action. All right, everybody. Thank you all very much. I know I'm 7.5 minutes over. I will see you next week.